We'll begin with our program. Welcome. Welcome to our second Museum Studies at Noon event of the year, L'International and the Democracy Pavilion for Europe. I am very glad that you could join us today. My name is Kerstin Baunt, and I'm an associate professor of German and Museum Studies and the current director of the University of Michigan's Museum Studies program. I will be moderating today's discussion, introduce the speakers, and bring your questions to the attention of the panelists after their presentations. Please send us your questions via the Q&A function in Zoom at any time during the event. Thanks go out to our panel's co-sponsor, the University of Michigan Center for European Studies, and to my colleagues in the Museum Studies program, Administrative Assistant Amy Smolar and Associate Director Deirdre Henneberry for their support. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. Today, we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabeg ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. Today, we will hear from three highly accomplished and internationally renowned European curators of contemporary art and museum directors. In their boundary and border-defying work, they have advanced socially and politically engaged curatorial practices. In their past and present home institutions in the Netherlands, in Spain, and Slovenia and Croatia, as well as internationally through the platform of the Biennale and the Confederation L'International, our panelists have probed how art engages with and counters sociopolitical, geopolitical, and economic powers. How art and the art of curation map time and space, and how curatorial practices may foster a deeper and visionary understanding of the fragile idea and practice of democracy. So these words will be filled with life by our three presenters. And my colleague Ferran Barnblit, who is just a floor above me in this modern language building here on our campus, will present first about L'International, the Confederation, and I will introduce him first. And then we will hear from Charles Esche and Zdenka Barovinac. Ferran Barnblit is an internationally recognized museum director with extensive managerial and curatorial experience, who has led 3 museums in the last 20 years. Arts Santa Monica, 2002 to 2008, CA2M in Madrid from 2008 to 2015, and MACBA, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Barcelona from 2015 to 2021. Ferran was born in Buenos Aires and settled in Barcelona with his family in the 1970s, where he studied art history at the University of Barcelona. And he then continued his formative years in America, pursuing a graduate degree in museum studies at New York University, and working with director Marsha Tucker at the New Museum in New York. For the current academic year, we are delighted to host Ferran at the University of Michigan as a visiting professor. Here in Ann Arbor, he has been teaching courses both in English and in Spanish on art history, including a course entitled Directing and Programming for the Museum Studies program. He's an expert with a deep understanding of the political and social complexities of museums and the need to consider them as an essential catalyst for engaged citizenship. In this context, he has worked with many contemporary artists, including Andrea Fraser, Christina Lukács, Forensic Architecture, Jeremy Deller, Gregor Schneider, Melanie Smith, Rax Media Collective, and Teresa Margolis. Ferran's interests include the political potential of art, irony as one of the most powerful tools of culture since the 1960s, and post-colonial theory. He's a board member of L'Internationale. Ferran's last major group exhibition he created at MACBA was Action, a provisional history of the 90s. The show focused on the performance, reemergence of that decade. He's presently working on a solo show of French artist Ben Vautier for MUAC, the University Museum of Contemporary Art in Mexico City. Welcome, Ferran.
Thanks so much, Kirsten, for this introduction. Thanks also to Amy, Deirdre for the support in organizing this event and the whole team of the Museum Studies program, and to the University of Michigan for making this possible. For me, being here with two great friends as Charles and Zenka, it's really a unique opportunity of bridging the two worlds I've been involved in the last few years, that is L'Internationale and now the University of Michigan. And I would like also to acknowledge that I know that they are they are with us now, to Laura Gablier and Ashley Thompson from the European Cultural Foundation, as they have supported very generously the project that we will be presenting today. So welcome also to both of you. And I want to use very few minutes, because I want to pass the word as soon as possible to Zenka and Charles, to introduce L'Internationale. As I was thinking in the last few days how to introduce L'Internationale, for me it's a very complex thing. It's not easy. And it's not easy because it's something extremely emotional, extremely vital. And it's something that has been part of my life, and I think the life of my colleagues for the last year since it was created, in a way that is difficult to explain. I have to say, before being a part of L'Internationale, and sitting with my colleagues in 2015 when I joined MACBA, for me it was a kind of an envy. Wow, that's an incredible space of sharing experiences that could go much beyond the already organized spaces that could be a bit bureaucratic. I'm talking about all kinds of professional associations or institutional associations that are extremely necessary, but maybe still have a certain distance from the actual interference in reality. Internationally is mostly about that. It can be its success. I think it can be measured of how a real effect has. I mean, in the institutional lives, but also in the life of the people who is involved in them. I mean, from the staff of all of the organizations to all of the constituents around the organizations. I mean, that includes obviously the whole art world, but also to every single visitor that the organization has. I would give an example. As you were saying, my last project at MACBA as a curator was a show about the performance in the 90s, and that was inserted in the Internationale project. How to explain Internationale? I mean, institutional way of explaining it, and I think that we have to have that's a point of departure, is that it's an European Union funded program via Creative Europe that brings together 7 major European art institutions. That is the museums in Ljubljana, the Museo Reina Sofia in Madrid, the MACBA in Barcelona, the MUJA in Antwerp, the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw, Poland, SALT in Istanbul, and the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, with a number of partners such as the HDK in Ballant in Gothenburg in Sweden, and the School of Fine Arts in Dublin in Ireland. Until now, the program that started in 2010, that's 12 years ago, had gone through 3 phases, and that are linked to how, I mean, the European structure is organized. Creative Europe is organized in periods that we followed, and that also were generating a path to follow. The first was art from the decline of modernism to the rise of globalization, a project that challenged conventional and placid art history and instigated new narratives, latitudes and chronologies that could generate a new narrative, maybe that could be better adapted to the complexities of contemporaneity. You have to think that in 12 years, the world has changed a lot. And I think that was the first moment in that a number of organizations were involved in starting this trip. I mean, to question how art history has been written. The second phase was the uses of art. That continued the itinerary, trying to explore the 80s and the beginning of the trans-European civil society that was set in that moment. I mean, in the moment that the European Union was not any longer an economic union, but something that we called European Union. And then the last and still the present phase, that is our many Europes, that focus in the 90s, a moment in which contemporary Europe was born, and it was the center of so many tensions and contradictions that were reflected, obviously, both in the art that was produced in that era, but also how it was responsible by some institutions, some of them that are already part of this history. So now I think that we are in a moment that we can already discover how the impact of the organizations that we worked in had in contemporary art. As you know, I mean, L'Internazionale is not, I mean, our name is not our invention. It's taken from the anthem and the workers' anthem that begins with "Arise, ye workers, from your slumbers," but remembers that at the end that so comrades come rally, and at the last fight, let us face the Internationale unites the human race. And something of that is in Internationale, because we have always defended some values that are unnegotiable for us. I mean, that are so important that I would say that will be at the beginning and at the departure point of every single project, bigger or smaller, that Internationale has. Values based on difference, antagonism, solidarity, commonality, and that could be all condensed in one single concept: the belief that radical democracy is our trench, the position that we all share, and that we have to fight from it and to defend it. We don't have many more tools than our will to do it, and the critical imagination that can be projected to every project, and is part of the activation of both an institutional attitude and an attitude towards the art that we work with. There are many other elements, but it would be too long to explain that Internationale deals with them. A resistance to the standardization of individual and collective beings, and the defense of some concepts dealing with civic institutions, citizenship, and democracy. But the important thing is that the Internationale considers that we have a power to question, a power to challenge every system, being white or being even related to our own institutions, and that we have to discuss and not give nothing as granted, and knowing that democracy is something that has to be defended from those points in every single day of our work. There's something also about internationalism and how we consider Europe, that at some point, I have to say, for my generation, Europe in a certain point was seen only as a structure that could be economic and trying to impose a single system for the whole continent. But it took not long to discover that Europe is our last resource to defend and the values that we believe in. And that are values that I'm sure that most of European citizens will share, of solidarity, fraternity, and the need to defend a system and that is based on some notions of progress that have been with us for a very long time. A common heritage that also is projected to discussing, the colonial legacies and trying to active collective emancipation that would deal to a more fair post-colonial understanding of the world. But at the end, L'Internationale is also something very emotional. I will finish with this. It's hard to explain, how emotional a group can become and how significant can be for the lives of each one of us. I'm not talking about my colleagues at, directing the organizations, but also most of the staff involved in the organizations that we have that we work for. I learned so many things about solidarity, about comradeship, about a place where we could share our political anguishes, our concern about the future of our institutions, our societies. I found very few other places than Internationale where those ideas could be shared. And this has been something that I think has been even more important. This emotional aspect that has been that in every single moment of our history, including, I have to say, for example, during the lockdown, where we met every week. And it was the space when we could share. Okay, what to do now? How? We need to know. We needed to know what the other organizations were doing, but also, how to deal with something that we didn't, were ready for. And I have to say that all those meetings every week were extremely significant, not only to take the right decisions, but also to share this lack of air that was part of the pandemic, that arrived to every one of us, and that's why it's an experience that is very difficult for you. And as you know, I could talk about Internationale, but I think that we have to focus in the Pavilion. But I think it's in 90% of these ideas are involved in the Pavilion. Thanks, Gaston.
Thank you, Ferran. And I can only imagine how meaningful that that institutional support in this group has been during the pandemic and beyond. And also, to sort of fill this group with life, with political and institutionally future-oriented life. I see that Zdenka has found her way to us. So welcome, Zdenka. I'm glad that this has worked out. Would you be ready to be our second speaker?
Yeah, okay. So
I will introduce you then. Curator and art writer Zdenka Baruinas has just been appointed director of the Museum of Contemporary Art, Zagreb. Zdenka is well known for her long tenure at the Museum of Modern Art in Ljubljana, Moderna Galeria, and at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Metelkova, which she directed from 1993 until 2020. In December 2020, Zdenka was forced by Slovenia's new conservative government to leave the directorship of the museum in Ljubljana after her vigorous curatorial leadership had turned that museum into one of Europe's most relevant art institutions, generating a dialogue between the historical avant-garde and contemporary art, and promoting a new and more complex geopolitical approach to Slovenian art. We are living in an era of cognitive capitalism, where maps are more important than actual territories, she once said. Under these conditions, what's important is not maintaining the integrity of given territory, but rather widening the participation in mapping the world. And these are Zdenka's words. The Zdenka's interest in recontextualizing avant-garde traditions began in 1998 with the exhibition Body and the East from the 1960s to the present at the Moderna Galleria. She served as a Slovenian commissioner at the Venice Biennale from 1993 to 97, 2005, and 2017, and as Austrian commissioner at the Sao Paulo Biennale in 2002. She also initiated the first Eastern European art collection, Art East 2000 Plus collection. One of her last curatorial projects during the pandemic was Bigger Than Myself, Heroic Voices from Ex-Yugoslavia, from Maxi in Rome, the National Museum of 21st Century Art. And that exhibit opened during the pandemic last year in 2021. A founding member of l'Internationale, Zdenka also served as the president of CIMAM, the International Committee for Museums and Collections of Modern Art, from 2011 to 2013. In 2020, she received the Igor Zabel Prize for Culture and Theory for her outstanding contribution to Eastern Europe and global art history. Welcome, Zdenka.
Thank you very much, Kerstin, for this beautiful introduction. So I think I can say some words maybe about the Internationale. We say, you know, when we first met, we decided, the colleagues, the founding members, that each of us would pronounce the name in our local way. So I say Internationale, which is more like Slovene way. And the name comes from the workers' anthem. So in French would be l'Internationale, but so I sometimes combine. It was founded in 2010 in Ljubljana, and actually we initiated it here as we had in Moderna Galleria an idea that it would be an appropriate project to compare Eastern European art that has been always in our focus with the art from Latin America, from the other, you know, non-Western contexts. But then gradually the method and the mode of work, the collaboration became as equal as the content. And I think this is very specific of Internationale, that the way how we work is so important. And I think that's why Internationale serves as a kind of alternative to other international networks, museums, institutional networks. And as Ferran mentioned before, we have been meeting all the time, especially of course in time of pandemic. And I think working together now almost 11 years and something, we went together through different social, political, personal dramas, turns. For example, in 2015, the refugee crisis started in Europe, and I think that was a big turn in our activities. It affected not only Internationale, but all European institutions somehow tried to be solidary with refugees coming from the Middle East, from North Africa. And then, of course, the pandemic, and Ferran mentioned how we were constantly together asking ourselves what would be the task of the institution in such a specific circumstances, how we can be more solidary with the cultural workers, how to help them, how to help the artists without, you know, condition to make their life better. They left, suddenly the income was much lower than before. Not only the income of the individuals, but also of the institutions. We learned recently the UNESCO's report from the pandemic, and it's really, very, very, I was really surprised to learn how much we all lost, not only in terms of income, but also, being without the project means also being without the tools for, exchange, communication. You always need to have something like a content to build your stories around. So we went together through different situation, affects, and personal dramas also. You mentioned before me, Ferran left, and before Ferran, Bartomeu Marie was in Magba who left, and there were always, big stories around directors leaving the positions, and mine, it is related to the question of the situation in Slovenia, which I think I can mention a little bit later, but just to mention one project that I think is important. We did many, but specifically I think the glossary of common knowledge, the one that also was initiated in Ljubljana, is I think very important because it is transversal project that connects different institutions. So the curators from the institutions, the members of the Internationale, they collaborate now for 6-7 years already in this project of glossary of a common knowledge, which is actually a kind of platform for translating between different social, political and cultural context. And I think exactly this translating is very important in Internationale, and not only the need to be understood and to be translated, but also the need to change the dominant models of translation. And this was exactly the task of the glossary, to try to find a different alternative model of translation. So what it actually means, more concretely, it means that we invited different narrators. We called all people who participate with their term in the glossary. We call them narrators from the specific reasons, because we want also to refer to the oral histories, to non-written history, to this power relation between the word, the written word, and unwritten and unknown histories. And it is actually more, it is not so much about the oral in terms of authentic voice, but more about this relation between the voice and another voice, about the language as a social practice, I would say. So we conceive the glossary around different, we call them referential fields, like historicization, geopolitics, subjectivization, other institutionality, the commons, and the constituencies. And as you can hear, these are the words that are pretty common in the art world jargon. But we wanted to ask all the narrators to create their terms that would explain this more general referential field in their more particular ways. And we organized different seminars where the terms were presented and we discussed them, and thus also somehow organized the collective editing process. at the end, we published of the first 4 years, we published the book, and now we are continuing with the glossary. And then, the important project of Internationala, the last one, and the major event will happen here in Ljubljana again in 2 weeks, is Democracy Pavilion. It is the project supported by European Cultural Foundation, and its main question is what art and culture can do for democracy, how to discuss democracy, how to think beyond the existing model of democracy. And I think that art and art institutions today are one of the rare spaces where we can still discuss it in more creative and more visionary way. So the question is, of course, why the conference will take place in Ljubljana, and there is an answer related also to my personal drama, let's say. So I just want to say that I was not really fired. My contract expired, and it was not prolonged as the contracts of 6 other directors of the national institutions. At the same year, we were not prolonged, and we were replaced by the people for whom the experts in Ljubljana think that are not the right people, that they were politically nominated. So we in Ljubljana and elsewhere in Eastern Europe, we face the lack of democracy. Democracy is under the threat, and we are talking about new autocratic regimes. And local artists, intellectuals, activists, they are now protesting already 2 years against the government, against how the government treats the question of democracy. And this is not only Slovenia, but also in other Eastern European countries. We talk about similar things that we could name also the cultural war. The cultural war against the progressive forces. So what this cultural war means, I know that in the United States you also have a kind of cultural war, but probably more, each of our wars has its own specificities. And what is specific in our cultural war, I think it is that is more caught in the frame of 2 blocks that society is split in, the right and left block. And it is a war against progressive-minded and socially and politically critical artists and intellectuals, and also progressive institutions. So the cultural war in our region is taking place in the name of injustice. I would put it in the brackets, injustice that in the past and until the takeover of power by right-wing and nationalist authorities allegedly happened to all those who were not part of the leftist world view. One way to enforce the correction of such injustice is to replace people in the key positions, as my case was also in cultural institutions, with the people, with the repressed members from this opposite right-wingers bloc. So the people, as me, as the progressive contemporary artists and intellectuals in the last 2 years, we got the label we became so-called cultural Marxists. So the term cultural Marxist, I think, was used also by Breivik. So it's also, very reactionary and very problematic term in terms of who are the people using it. And in our case, the right-wingers use the name cultural Marxist in the name of democracy. Here I would like only briefly to mention also some specifics in difference between leftists, left-wingers and right-wingers as we have here in the territory in the former Yugoslavia. So just to make it more understandable for those who are not so familiar with our region problematics. So among the other things, leftists, the left-wingers built on the tradition of anti-fascist struggle against the occupier in the Second World War and have a positive attitude towards some aspects of socialism, as we had, especially this refers to so-called, so we call it social state. It is something like welfare state, but it is very important, especially today in the time of pandemic, to mention how how good system, medical system, for example, the school system, everything was free, and this is something that we try to emphasize as a positive heritage from the times of socialism. And the right-wingers, comparing to the leftists, they present the people, so all the struggles, two blocks, it's a kind of continuation of the national conflicts in the Second World War. So we have left like partisan or anti-occupiers, and we have right-wingers who were more linked also to the collaborators with the Nazis, actually. So the right-wingers today are trying to present their collaboration and we call them white guard, the people who were connected with the occupiers, as the victims of the communists. It's very complex, of course, for those who don't know this history, but it is important just to mention it, to understand the issues of the democracy in our part of the world, where all of us, the more progressive people, are labeled as, heirs of this communists from the Second World War, and today we are labeled as the cultural Marxists. So the term cultural Marxist, actually, when our Prime Minister Janez Janša uses it, this term is a tool in his conspiracy theory that tries to present the cultural Marxists as those who control all areas of public art life, including media, schools, economy, culture, art, national systems of the government. And it is a label that tries to present people, the progressive people, as the people who fight against nation, family, private property, private education, and religion. So we got the government at the same time as the pandemic was proclaimed epidemic in Slovenia. So it was in March 2 years ago. Almost at the same moment, we got the protesters on the streets, on the bicycles. And they now, until today, they have been protesting for 2 years against the government corruption, police violence, militarization, capitalism, and also environmental distractions. A lot of protesters are the artists, are the intellectuals, and there are many, also visually very interesting responses to the situation. So in the Ljubljana conference, Democracy Pavilion, we will have one of the 3 days will be dedicated to the protesters, and we will have 12 leaders from different groups of protesters, and the groups are about anarchists and environmental activists, women's rights activists, and refugees, and of course more politically motivated people. So, as I said, this is not a unique situation in Slovenia, but it is more or less now present in all former socialist countries that also are united in so-called Visegrad group. And this Visegrad group of the countries, Slovenia is not part, but is very in sympathy with this group. It's very close, they are friends, especially with the Hungarian leader Orban. So this bloc is today named as an illiberal bloc. And this is also something that I would like to emphasize, because it became, this word illiberal became a word in our artistic intellectual jargon today. So when we say that something is illiberal, it says also that there is another bloc which is more liberal, more, let's say, democratic. But here it is important to say that authoritarians, illiberals, share actually the same basic neoliberal policy that supports the big private economic power, strong repressive state in its service, and political disposition of the people. So that's why it's so important to discuss the liberal model of democracy, and this is the one of the goals of our project, Democracy Pavilion, and the conference, to discuss, and we will have people who will discuss the artists, the different initiatives, the possible models of democracy that go beyond the liberal model of democracy. So I would just like to mention, I'm probably too long, you should stop me. It's okay.
Yeah, if you could wrap up, that would be great. Yeah, it's wonderful.
Okay, so just to conclude, for me personally, the Democracy Pavilion, which is not the name that we coined here, but it is the project of the European Cultural Foundation. But the word pavilion has a specific meaning for me and my colleagues, because it serves also as a metaphor for semi-autonomous space, a space which is semi-out, but still related to the so-called main building. And here, main building is also, of course, a metaphor for the broader system, political, cultural system. And in the situation as we have at the moment, where my colleagues from Moderna Galleria and me, we can't continue with our ideas and the contents, as was the case before, when we also had some ideas about the democratic museum, for example. We find the shelter in the pavilion, and the conference in Ljubljana is being produced not by Moderna Galleria, of course in collaboration with Internationale, but with a research center that works at the Academy for Art and Science here in Ljubljana. So the Internationala and the research center became our pavilion, our shelter, for these ideas. Okay, so I think I can stop here maybe, and then of course I will be open to answer the questions.
Thank you so much. Do you understand me?
No, now I hear you, but before I didn't.
Okay, yes. Thank you so much, Zdenka, and also for bringing us into Ljubljana and also mapping out how meaningful it is that the pavilion actually will be located and will happen, that these discussions will happen in Ljubljana at this moment, in this moment of time. I will now turn to our third speaker and introduce him, Charles Esche. And he is a Scottish curator, museum director, professor, and writer. Since 2004, Charles has been serving as the director of the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven. And at the University of the Arts London, he founded and co-directs the After All Research Center and After All Journal and Books. In London and at the Jan van Eyck Academy in Maastricht, he teaches exhibition and curatorial studies. Previously, he was director of the Roseum in Malmö, Sweden, Museum of Contemporary Art, and Tramway in Glasgow. Charles has served on curating teams for a great number of international exhibitions, including Europalia Indonesia, Power and Other Things at the Center of Fine Arts, Beaux-Arts Brussels in 2017, Art Turns, Word Turns at the Museum Makan, Jakarta's Museum for Modern and Contemporary Art. In Jakarta, he also worked for the city's Biennale in 2015. In 2012, he curated It Doesn't Always Have to Be Beautiful Unless It's Beautiful at the National Art Gallery of Kosovo, and worked together with Zdenka on the Triennale in Ljubljana. In 2007 and 2009, he formed a curating team with Ram Fada and Khalil Rabah, and together they worked for the second and third Riwak Biennale in Ramallah, Palestine. Last but not least, Charles also served twice on curating teams for the Istanbul Biennale and co-curated the Gwangju Biennale 2002 in Korea together with Hu Han-ru. Charles' globally encompassing work focuses on the constitution of art institutions and centers, including the institution of the Biennale. His writings on institutional possibilities and policy rethink the relation between art and social change. In 2012, he received the Princess Margaret Award, and in 2014, the CCS Bard College Prize for Curatorial Excellence. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you very much, and for that rather embarrassing introduction. I'm not sure what it means in 2022, actually, to have that list. Mind you, I guess it means you're quite old, but also that that you kind of have a different, a need to change your focus. Because that international, that kind of globalism that represents, I think is quite problematic now. So it's funny. And I stopped being Scottish after they refused to vote for independence in 2014. So, but it was nice that you said it. I'm a Dutch passport holder, I should say. I escaped from the British Empire a little bit, only to find the Dutch one. I think, you know, Zdenka and also Ferran have spoken a lot, and I think it would be nice also if we had some time for some questions and some exchange. So I don't want to say too much, but I think it's interesting from the point of view of a US audience to understand the different positions within Europe that Internationale tries to encompass or tries to understand without prioritizing one or the other. So I would quite like to speak from the Netherlands and from Van Abbe Museum in the way that Zdenka spoke from Ljubljana, also to understand the specificities of that location. And it was very important, I thought, Kirsten, when you started and you mentioned the Anishinaabe and the history of the site that you were on. And I know this becomes a kind of protocol that we're all in the settler colonial societies. There's an encouragement to recognize that, and I think it's important, but it's also maybe worth standing still a moment, because on that, from the point of view of the Netherlands, because the Netherlands represents, together with the other European littoral societies from Portugal to Scotland, basically, represents the colonial origin, the origin of coloniality, the system of colonialism, which includes the transatlantic slave trade, that has built the world in which many, but not everybody, but many of us inhabit. And that structure, that coloniality, that matrix of power that produced that system is continuing to reproduce itself. And when we think about democracy, that is also a production of coloniality, just like modernity is a production of coloniality. So of course, these things have interwoven, they've affected each other, they've changed each other. It's not that there's a simple cause and effect, but essentially without coloniality, there is no democracy and there is no modernity, both of which are things that we are in some senses representing. So from a Dutch position, from a Dutch located position in Eindhoven, which is a provincial city in the Netherlands, it's important, I think, for us to understand when we speak about democracy, we have to first understand our coloniality and to see what we're prepared to do about it in 2022, which I don't think is that sort of globalism of the CV that you read out. What that might mean is that we first of all need to understand, for instance, the specifics of the Van Abbe Museum was founded in 1936 by a cigar manufacturer. And the tobacco came from the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia. So there is a very, very direct and absolutely clear dependence on coloniality, on the colonial system, for the existence of Van Abbe. Without the Dutch Empire, there is no Van Abbe. And so our task is to understand, in a sense, how we can reduce the harm that we are doing, first and foremost, rather than what kind of prospects or projects we can throw into the world that are projective, yeah? that are thinking about how we might solve other people's problems. The problem is, how can we reduce the harm which is embedded in essentially a tainted archive? Yeah? The modern art archive is a tainted archive. And we all know that from its gender representations, but many, many kinds of exclusions. The difference between the ethnographic museum and the modern art museum are very, very clear for us to speak about, and still are being continued. So a lot of the harm that's been done through coloniality is represented in our DNA, yeah, in the very conditions which gave us birth. And that's a different condition than the condition in Ljubljana, but it's also a related condition. And I think one of the things that maybe is interesting for your students to think about is how those relations within Europe need to be unpacked, and maybe how a situation of settler colonial societies in America and the differences that maybe could be represented between, say, New York and Ann Arbor in terms of power and structure and things like that, could also help, and how you explain that. You know, I mean, is every modern art museum a cookie cutter version of MoMA in New York? Or is it possible to have different kinds of modern art museum? And I think that's still a question that's up for grabs. If you look at the collections, the cookie cutter version is more or less sustained right through until today. So to some extent, you could say, and you know, MoMA's own attempts to, we could say, decolonize itself, also a sort of evidence of the fact that there's still a degree of universality around modern art museums' claims for their relevance. So in that context, then, how can we, maybe we need to learn to differentiate ourselves much more specifically. And one of the concepts that two concepts that we've been using within Internationale to develop that sense of differentiation right from the beginning, I think, were the idea of having located or situated narratives that we could bring in relationship to each other, but didn't try to merge or force themselves into a single narrative that we wanted to tell across the Confederation. So that meant that those narratives that were told in Spain, those narratives that were told in Istanbul, those now in Turkey, those narratives that were told in Slovenia, and those narratives told in the Netherlands and in Warsaw, etc., were in themselves narratives that were not that could not be brought into alignment, and that lack of alignment was actually the point. And I think we distinguished ourselves from the narratives of MoMA or perhaps Centre Pompidou, perhaps the Tate in the British Empire in terms of its production of meaning recently. I think in the 21st century, it wasn't so powerful before. That those institutions which try to encompass still a universalist position in relationship to art production and in relationship to a singular narrative. So I think Internationale offers that plurality, that plurivocality, if you like, as opposed to the monoculture of the bigger organizations, even the franchise organizations. Centre Pompidou is franchised, Tate is franchised, and it's I suppose MoMA is franchised a little bit with PS1, but it's quite surprising that it's not so franchised. But the Guggenheim across the road is franchised. So there's clearly evidence from those institutions that they're telling or trying to tell a singular narrative with perhaps a little bit of local spice, a little bit of particularity where it doesn't interfere with the universal narrative that's trying to be told. But as soon as it would interfere, then it would be excluded, I would suspect. So that's the condition in which also the Pavilion, I think, is trying to argue about democracy as a situated form of practice, perhaps. And that brings us on maybe to think about this difference between the post-colonial and the post-socialist, and they use those as sort of historic terms now, which need to be understood perhaps through the lens of the decolonial in very different ways. So the decolonial and decolonizing, the nice thing about decolonial is that it's a verb. You can't post-colonize, but you can decolonize. That's an important distinction. So decolonize as a verb can be applied to different conditions, and we can start to understand what those differences are through that theoretical construct. And I say, why do I say we should look at the decolonial as an important starting point for analyzing our different situated conditions? And it's because the decolonial is the only theory that I know that acknowledges, recognizes, accepts that there is an outside of modernity. That most other theories, including most leftist theories stemming from Marxism, see essentially a closed system of the modern, and then want to find reform within that, but don't see other epistemologies, other knowledges that might be represented in some senses by the Anishinaabe in certain situations, that don't see those as being valid to the questions that arise within the modern enclosure. See them as being backwards, see them as being primitive, see them as being indigenous. There are lots of words, some more polite than others, but nevertheless, there's a sort of exclusion of that dialogue. And I think the decolonial, by recognizing that there is an outside which has valuable knowledge, which can speak to the earth in different ways than modernity is deaf to the earth, then that relationship is one that helps us to understand where we might have things in common while recognizing the situatedness. Yeah? So the decolonial gives us the tools to talk about the communal that we might have, I think, in relationship to difference and in relationship to specificity. And so then, and there are, I mean, for students that are here, that on the Internationale Online website, there are a few texts. If you search for democracy or you look under decolonizing practices in the online journals, then you'll find, I can recommend, I can type them in later, Madina Klostanova or Etienne Osayemwese. A couple of essays which I think are very interesting to look at, that explore some of these, and also some conversations that we've had under the title Art and Democracy a few years before, pre-pandemic, which was also another world. So essentially, not to go on too long, I think that process of using the Pavilion to try and bring together these differences, to see what might be built communally, to recognize the differences as being valid and important to understand, is something that I hope the Democracy Pavilion and this term democracy, this problematic term democracy, yeah, because democracy, as we said, emerges from coloniality, from the system of colonialism, which is still in existence. So the extent to which we can address democracy from our different points of view, and also perhaps understand that democracy is not the goal, that it's more of a tool, it's more of a mechanism, that the goal is perhaps to live well within the means of the earth and to stop harming, to do less harm. So can democracy help us to do less harm? I think is maybe the question that that is in the core of the Democracy Pavilion. It's in a way focusing on democracy in order to try and talk about something else, but democracy could be a route to it. And I think we all know, and we don't need to repeat it, that the democracy that we know, that liberal democracy that Orban and Janša and these other people and Kaczynski are opposing with their illiberal democracy, that liberal democracy does not have a response to illiberal democracy that is actually adequate to the task. So if it doesn't have that response, then we're pulling on the lever of liberal democracy, if you like. We're pulling on these levers. I mean, in the United States, I suppose you might recognize this in some extent. I mean, Biden is pulling on these levers and they don't work anymore, but there isn't anything else that he's got to pull on. So then there's a sort of repetition, no, of going through the impossibility of trying to make things that should work. And this sort of shock on your face when it's like you put your foot on the brake in the car, I suppose, and it doesn't work. I mean, that's become so profoundly disturbing, no, to everything that you in your body, you feel that. And I think we're at that point where the brake doesn't work. And then what do? Do you just go and go down the hill as fast as you can and hope that you can steer the car, or do you crash it, or do you think maybe I have to jump out of the car and let it blow up and see if I can survive that way? Those kind of options are the options I think that we're in, and maybe the Democracy Pavilion can be a place in which those discussions can take place. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Ferran. Thank you, Zdenka. You have given us quite a lot to think with and to think through. And Charles left us with this disturbing image of the car accident, which I also wake up more often than I want to. And yes, a lot of what you have brought to the table resonates with our situation, our contemporary situation here in the US, and let's bracket for a moment what's going on in the Ukraine. But this is really this is what we are living with, and on both sides of the Atlantic. There are two questions. Two audience members in the audience, Maria and Ares, they would like to hear more about l'Internationale. And I'll bring these questions to you. You can also read them if you open the Q&A. So Maria wrote her master thesis about l'Internationale, so it's not a surprise to me that your collaborative association confederation has prompted scholarship, and she engaged with it as a model of institutionalizing contemporary art based on cutting-edge methodologies. And also as a model on how institutions can collaborate with each other and be more inclusive. So her question to you is, why did the initial model of active institutional participation, why was that abandoned? What is the element of the methodology you believe failed in the history of l'Internationale? Or is it just that our contemporaneity has changed and that the world we live in now prompted a change in practice? Who would like to take this question on? Charles, yeah?
Yeah, it's answering a question with a question, which we learned from the Americans. No? But how, to what extent, or why do you think it's been abandoned? I'm sorry, we can't have a conversation here, but I wonder why you think that transnational collaboration has been abandoned. I think maybe I suspect it's more because we have a sense that that's almost part of the operating system with which Internationale functions now. So maybe we forget to name it. Because what is happening, for instance, a project that a colleague of mine, Nick Akins, is doing at the moment, is fully trans-institutional, let's say, in the sense that there are different people from MACBA, Ferran knows because he was still there when it started, and from Reina and from Ljubljana, Zdenka knows as well, Bojana's involved, that those practices, and I know that from that project, but there are many others that remain that trans-institutional. But maybe, I'd be interested if you could type in at all why you think it was abandoned. Maybe we could get closer to it.
Yeah, but I think that's good, you know, that you sort of say it's very much still a practice that is also an answer to that question, but it might not be in the foreground anymore. Ferran or Zdenka, would you like to add to what Charles just said?
No, I actually don't understand well the what is the name of the person who asks.
Maria. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what Maria concretely has on her mind about the active institutional participation. We didn't abandon it. I don't know. Maybe she can clarify it more.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And Ares is also, you know, commending you for l'Internationale as a model that provided an inspiration for bottom-up institution building in Kosovo, in Prizren. And Aris says, thank you for showing new ways of doing things together and for provoking more thoughts than one can process or act upon. And that's also kind of a very good summary of the presentations you shared with us. But that shouldn't, you know, stop us from articulating these thoughts and trying collectively to find ways to act upon. And that's how I understand the Democracy Pavilion. And Aris writes, I wonder if there are ways in which l'Internationale shares or can share its knowledge and engage in a dialogue with smaller initiatives and the peripheries of the centers in which you know, constituents are also situated. And moreover, I'm curious to know whether from within l'Internationale, whether there are other programs in Ljubljana, and whether there are any specific decolonial perspectives or decolonializing practices that is linked to the position of Albanians in Yugoslavia. So like a bouquet of questions. Who would like to begin to address them?
Maybe I can ask because it relates also to Ljubljana.
Right.
Yeah, we have been collaborating also with the smaller initiatives. And in the Internationale, we talk about the constituencies, which means that we also developed a certain horizontal collaboration with the individuals, with the activists, and with the smaller networks and also smaller spaces. In Ljubljana, we have been collaborating a lot also with the non-governmental NGOs initiatives. And we are now preparing a new program for Internationale, and we invited also not museum, not big spaces, from not centers, but this is still in process. So this will be more visible later. And as for the Albanian, I mean, you know, we didn't work specifically on the question of you know, a relation between Yugoslav and Albanian history, but we collaborated a lot specifically with the artists from Kosovo. Also, I curated personally a biennial one of my Charles has more big biennials, but I have few small, and one of them was, I think, in 2003 in Tirana. So there were some collaborations also, but never enough, of course. It's a very specific, you know, Albania and Kosovo specifically, which was part of Yugoslavia. And now this year, Manifesta is going to be there. And I'm curious also how it will relate to the questions that are posed in this message.
If I can add something to this question, I think that the geopolitics of Internationale are really part of the Confederation, in terms that we always have spoken from places, maybe with the only exception of Madrid, that, I mean, is the only one that has been an imperial capital. I mean, all the rest of the cities we speak from have been neglected as part of constructing the modernity, at least as it appears in the encyclopedia. And it's funny to read that, I mean, one could consider Ljubljana as a center. Maybe it is, no? But up to one extent that that in the contemporary geopolitical way of understanding the world, maybe it's not as such. No? And for me, this is one of the things that the Internationale has contributed with, understanding that there's a web that can be built. That's why, I mean, it's called Confederation, from hubs that are unexpected. I mean, as could be Eindhoven, could be Ljubljana or Barcelona, and I think that is something that, as we advance in this third decade of the 21st century, I think it will become more and more relevant. I mean, now that I'm speaking from this place called Ann Arbor, that is close to a city that is Detroit, that maybe it was a center of some and it was a place where modernity was invented, maybe in the 1920s. I mean, the huge industrial revolution that happened here, and it changed completely. I mean, we even gave a name to that. No? We call it Fordism. But speaking from this periphery now, and understanding that when we travel to bigger capitals and the way that the cultural institutions act, I mean, it's almost obscene. And I think that's another trench of resistance that Internationale can draw to. I mean, you can perfectly speak, and I remember, I think that, I don't know, I think it was Charles who said this, or maybe our colleague Bart. I mean, that you understand much better Europe from its boundaries rather than from the center. I don't remember who said that in a meeting, but I mean, I remember very well that. And I think that you can say that in every single context that you are, even in America.
Yeah, I think that's very, very powerful, Ferran, and that resonates with what Zdenka and Charles said, that to understand Europe from its periphery and to understand Europe within a historical global history that includes colonialism, you know, to sort of hold these simultaneities of perspectives together. I think that's what you are also good at, to actually name these simultaneities and not shy away from them, and also to then develop sort of a position of of at the same time being humble about art's promise, but at the same time also harness the power of art. There is another question from Mame or Mame. I've worked for the past 20 years with artists in the northeast of Brazil, whose works of arte popular, art of the people, this culminated in an NEH, that's an American art sponsor exhibition that toured the US for 7 years. Bandits and Heroes, Poets and Saints, Popular Art of the Northeast of Brazil, probed the historical issue of enslavement through more contemporary issues of landlessness, through the art of common people, and received thoughtful responses from visitors across the country. I wonder, though, how the voices of those artists and their worldview can be brought more directly into the pavilion you envision, without the intervening translations provided by curators and scholars.
Shall I take that one? Or?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe I can also link it to Arash's. Hello, Ash. Nice to see you. But to think about it's maybe interesting to say that in the new application and the new structure that we're thinking about for the next chapter of Internationale, we are including organizations which we would see as being part of an ecosystem in a certain sense, and maybe thinking about the museums as taking an appropriate place within that ecosystem and allowing space for other and smaller, in terms of financially smaller initiatives, such as a smaller initiative Transit in Romania, or as Zdenka mentioned, the Academy, which is a relatively small research institute in Slovenia, to be part of the confederation, in order to I think try and understand from those positions how the museums, the big museums like Reina Sofia, or MACBA, or even ours in terms of financial things, where we're sort of middle-sized, that they can be supportive of those grassroots organizations we're completely dependent upon also as institutions. And so I said that in relationship to the Northeast, because I think the difficulty that we have is the funding structures which exist within Europe are largely European based, and we have a huge problem in Europe in understanding if we do want to be together, and in what ways we want to be together, while not losing a sense of agency over our own conditions, if you like. Yeah, and that's a collective agency, not an individual agency, because that's all consumerism and shopping. So how do you get that that agency organized is a big struggle for Europe at the moment. And so there's a reason for focusing on Europe, because it's such a difficult problem. At the same time, because of the historic question of colonialism, which is an ongoing system of power, but has a certain historic dimension for Europe being the center of that power. Europe's not necessarily the only center of that coloniality anymore. Then how does it relate to questions like, for instance, from the Northeast in Brazil? And I think that we're still struggling with that question. Like, I think that if we were able to construct, what's interesting about Mame or Mame's question is that it's about a sort of direct relationship that you might have with that popular culture, arte popular from arte popular, arte popular, it should be in Brazilian. What happens with that if it's academicized in a way, and there's always a tendency, I think, for us to academicize things anyway. So that would require the kind of capacities that museums do have to present work without academicizing it, or at least allow something to escape in the confrontation, in the meeting with the work, which is not already legislated for within the mediation, if you like. And so I think that there's a potential to do that, but at the moment the reach is too far for us. And so it comes in through, it might come in through Lina Bobardi and her work in Nordeste in Brazil in that time. It might come in through a certain connection that, say, Reina Sofia particularly would have with Latin America, which then would allow, an artist like Leon Ferrari or something, who's also working within popular concerns in Argentina, to come into the museum. It's certainly not absent, but the direct presence in the way that you're talking about is something we should think about, but it feels like it's a step too far at the moment in bridging the gaps between the European necessities that we have and how we can account for our colonial history, as well as the coloniality which is still present.
Yes, thank you, Charles. And Zdenka, you talked about the translation project that is part of L'International. And I see, the way I understand that project, I understand it as also a partial answer to this question, but it has a more local focus. Is that right, Zdenka?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the question of translation has been one of the crucial questions in last 30 years since the art world became bigger. And of course, the first, the so-called centers try to understand us who are not from this Western, let's say, frame or cultural frame or epistemological frame. But there has been always a danger of the reductionism, to reduce the all different languages on one common denominator. And this is what I think in Internationale we at least try to avoid, that there is a master language, let's say, that all other languages would be translated to. So, and this is of course a difficult task, how to Charles used the word, I think, multivocal, so multivocal approach. So how to hear something when all these different voices speak together, because we need at the same time to have a strong position to the world, to the democracy, all these important issues for humanity and for the planet. So how to hear what is important for all of us, This is also, it's not so, many voices talk and each of us finally has a right, but it's also, important that there is a level where the urgencies and, the possible answers somehow come together, that there is a resonance between the different voices. I think this resonance is important, and maybe this is the answer. It's not about the multi only, that many speak, but it is about that many we also resonate in important questions for all of us, for all human beings and for the planet.
Thank you. That Zdenka is almost a wonderful. These were wonderful closing remarks, but I also wanted to give Charles and Ferran the opportunity to say a few words, if you would like, to close our event for today.
As I want Charles to be the last, then I would just, as I'm sitting at this side of the Atlantic now, say thanks to Zenka and Charles, wish them a lot of luck and energy because the Democracy Pavilion is even not started yet. I mean, it's starting now, and there's a long, long way. Now, I know that the meeting in Ljubljana will happen in only some weeks. That was postponed due to the Omicron. And I think that most of these elements will appear, and the thing with that pavilion is that it's I think it's the pavilion that can travel really easily. Now, in fact, it traveled here, no, and it has been hosting all of us to discuss these topics, and I think that it will be something that will last for a long time. And now it's filled with more and more questions. Charles.
I'd just like to say thanks to Ferran for organising this and allowing us to speak. And it's good to rehearse some of these things. It also helps us prepare for the pavilion when it kicks off on the 9th of March as a meeting and not as a building. Yeah, just thank you to University of Michigan and the Museum Studies for inviting us, and I hope we get a chance to do something like this again, and I hope you're enjoying yourself in Michigan, Ferran, and it's nice to see you always. Come back to Europe sometime soon though as well.
Yes, I mean, we are just so delighted to make this possible, and also, thank Ferran for making it possible. And thank you, Charles and Zdenka, and best of luck for the launch of the first instantiation of the pavilion. And we will surely follow your work and the work of the pavilion, and look forward to more conversations. Thank you so much. And thank you also to our audience. Have a good week, and see you soon. Bye-bye.